This is History of U.S. Comedy from 1900 to Present by Maggie Nelson and Finn Seeger. The origin of comedy in America starts in the early 1900s with projects such as silent films and stand-up comedy. Silent film stood out the most, and it was the most appealing to the crowds that were interested in something new. An example of one silent film includes Princess Nicotine, or The Smoke Fairy She Was Called, which was a short film created in 1909 designed to not only advertise smoking, but to sensationalize it as magic. The film included stop motion and dancing, both newer additions to be available to watch, and this was the simple baseline for many films just like this one in the early 1900s that followed. Actors weren't quite as big of a deal in the early days of comedy because of the lack of talking and the lack of true quality that the cameras could show, so producing didn't require big-name actors to do well. Even so, many companies started moving to Los Angeles, California in aspiration for the genre to take off and make money. This was the beginning of a comedy in America and the beginning of a future thriving industry. In the next decade following the 1910s, comedy was still held back by sound, and every film continued to be silent, which was something producers had to work around. Actors such as Charlie Chaplin benefited off this because of their great acting skills coming from their dancing, movements, and facial expressions, which showed character without word. Chaplin was also one of the first major actors to move to Hollywood and pursue his career from there, which set an example for other young, inspired comedians who wished to follow the same route. In fact, Chaplin was one of the first actors to move to Hollywood at all, and he did this less than a year after the first movie studio in the Hollywood area opened, called Nestor Studios in 1911 by Al Christie. Chaplin was most identifiable by his character The Little Tramp, which thrived in the no-sound era of comedy. Buster Keaton was another actor that shared a similar story with Chaplin, as they both started their acting career young and they made bold decisions to impact their lives forever. Keaton had been doing stunts in a public scene with his family for a long time, and by the age of 21, he was a seasoned comedian and ready to test open waters with the filming industry. Overall, the 20s were full of big changes for comedians, as many took big steps to improve their careers. In the late 1920s, a huge change for comedy occurred. In 1927, the first talkie was produced called The Jazz Singer, or in other words, the first sound in comedy created. The first line ever spoken was, wait a minute, you ain't heard nothing yet," by Al Jolson, which became an iconic phrase in Hollywood. People knew that movies with sound were the future, but the technology had to catch up with people's ambitions first. Thomas Edison, as early as 1889, believed that they needed to be created and a technology had to be developed for sound and film. The Jazz Singer was displayed at Warner Theater in Times Square, and it surprised the entire opening night audience into disbelief when the words were spoken. The 1930s and 40s followed this major event were completely different, as actors began to be more important to movie success, and people began more invested in comedy because of the engagement that talking gave the audience. An underrated part of the 1930s in comedy was that the Great Depression was going on during this time. And while people more than ever needed comedy during the Depression, the actors lost their jobs commonly. Overall, though, Hollywood was benefiting from the Depression, even if it didn't seem like it at all times, as in the early 30s, they saw more attendance than ever, even if later on, in the late 30s, they saw a decline of over 40%. As the 50s and 60s of comedy rolled into America, people began to become bored of the stagnant nature of comedy that was starting to form. Hollywood needed new ideas and fast for the revenue to continue and for the genre of comedy to keep thriving. One step that comedy took was to become more familiar and accessible to the average American so that more people might choose to watch it. The 50s for comedy was the true time in which it became more about business than just a fun entertainment service than ever. On July 15th, 1940, with films starting to get bigger and more people having TVs, comedy chose to relate to everyday life to make people feel better about having an average life and to glorify being just okay, which in turn improved business. In the early 60s, though, comedy still needed more content, and so lewd humor comedy was born. People started breaking the boundaries of staying inside the lines with societal norms, and they chose to make jokes that the average person would relate to and find extra funny because it was sensitive and not said before. This helped entice America and keep them interested in the comedy industry. Overall, the 1950s and 60s for comedy was all about new beginnings in business, developing their audience with a new marketable plan, and breaking boundaries from previous decades to set up the future for comedy very well.
The 1970s were the birth of the comedy that we know today. It became less about empty laughs and more about taking the situation around you and turning that truth into comedic commentary. And in this way, comedians could express their distaste with society and tell people about society's flaws and broadcast it to a larger and more receptive audience. George Carlin and Richard Pryor were two of the first comedians to take on issues like censorship and racism. Carlin was even arrested after one of his bits about 7 words you can't say on TV. Both of these comedians were important in establishing a new norm, and Pryor was instrumental in blazing the trail for other Black comedians like Eddie Murphy and Chris Rock. The 1970s also saw the birth of comedy clubs as well as Saturday Night Live, a popular sketch show that still runs today and is better known as SNL. Norman Lear's sitcom All in the Family also debuted in the 70s, tackling issues like racism, misogyny, women's rights, and homosexuality at a time when TV was becoming socially relevant. Johnny Carson also hosted The Tonight Show, and it was every comic's dream to get on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show because that's how most comics got their big break in the 70s. SNL also developed a reputation for launching their cast members into careers in comedy and entertainment. Just think about Tina Fey and Will Ferrell. After the rebirth of comedy in the 70s, the 80s saw a boom in the industry. There were more comedy clubs and more comedians than ever before. Sitcoms like Seinfeld, The Cosby Show, and Golden Girls gained popularity, and slowly but surely the industry was becoming more diverse. In 1983, Eddie Murphy became the first Black comedian to get a special on HBO. It's called Delirious. It's on Netflix if you're interested in it. Women like Carol Burnett and Mary Tyler Moore had laid the groundwork earlier in the century for comedians like Roseanne Barr and Ellen DeGeneres and Whoopi Goldberg to be able to succeed in the industry. Despite 95% of the stand-up scene being white straight men, women, people of color, and members of the LGBTQ plus community were using their truths and society's injustices in their routines to elbow their way into the comedic scene. Unfortunately, everything that goes up must come down, and in the 90s, the humor overload burst the comedy bubble of the 80s. And although live comedy shows lost popularity, televised comedy was taking off. The sketch show In Living Color debuted in 1990, featuring yet-to-be-known cast members like Damon Wayans, his brother Keenan, Jim Carrey, and Jamie Foxx, and that's just naming a few. As opposed to SNL, whose cast was predominantly white, In Living Color's cast was predominantly Black, and it tackled both issues and comedy from a different perspective than SNL or even The Cosby Show. Later in the 90s, Comedy Central was born, which is a 24-hour TV channel that has less censorship and all comedy all the time. This decade also saw the creation of the TV show South Park. It was also a great decade for diversity. Tina Fey became the first female writer ever for SNL in 1999, and Ellen came out both in real life and as her character on her sitcom, which paved the way for shows like Will and Grace and Glee to portray lead LGBTQ plus characters in their shows. The 90s also saw the creation of The Daily Show, which was created by 2 women, fun fact, and introduced sort of mainstream political satire in a dedicated environment. Now, modern comedy, so the 2000s and today, is all the stuff that we know and love. So Netflix specials and social media and all those kinds of platforms. The creation of YouTube made it possible for anyone to become famous, and comedy became accessible at your literal fingertips. There's also a very specific brand of humor amongst younger generations that older ones have trouble understanding, and that's sort of what these social media platforms in terms of comedy capture, with apps like Vine and Instagram and TikTok all sort of capturing that younger culture. Comedic podcasts, TV shows, movies, and even musical comedy has taken off over the last 20 years. And that's a lot of media to process, but it also means there are a lot of voices out there. Technology today has let us hear so many different perspectives through a wonderful platform, comedy. And with increases in diversity and outlets and material, comedy can only get better. Thank you.